Odd. Long before there was a single candle lit in Capernaum, long before the bread was set out on any table by the lake, there was a people who did not know how to rest, because they had never once been allowed to. They were slaves in the land of Egypt, and slaves are not given days off. Picture them under the hard white sun, generation after generation, their backs bent in the brick pits, or their hands raw, their children born into the same endless labor that had worn out their fathers. There was no seventh day for them. There was no evening when the work simply stopped and the soul could breathe. There was only the next task, and the next, and the master's voice, and the long grinding sameness of a life that was never, ever their own. They had forgotten, if they had ever known, what it was to rest. Hello there, friend, and welcome. However long your own week has been, however heavy the load you have been carrying into this night, you can begin now to set it down. You do not have to earn your place here. You do not have to finish anything first. You can let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and simply let yourself be still for a while, which is, as it happens, the very heart of the story we are going to tell tonight. For tonight our story is about rest, the kind of deep and holy rest that the world is always too busy to find, and about the strange and beautiful day that was given to a people who had forgotten how to stop. This is one more night on the long journey we are walking together, you and I, through the oldest and truest stories ever told. We have been getting to know the people whose lives were touched and turned by a man from Nazareth, the towns along a small grey lake in Galilee. Not long ago, we sat with a woman called Mary of Magdala, who had been lost in a darkness no one could lift, who was found and freed and called by her own name back into the light. Tonight we stay in her world, in the same lakeside town of Capernaum, but we widen the circle. Because a single day is coming that will fall across many different lives at once and show each of them, or like a quiet mirror, exactly where their hearts truly are. If these gentle journeys are a comfort to you at the close of your day, you are welcome to stay near and follow along. And if you feel like it, you might leave a soft tap on the like button before you drift off, since I am told it sleeps better when someone remembers it. And now, let us go back to that people in Egypt who had forgotten how to rest, because the day we are speaking of began with them. For there came a time when that enslaved people was set free, led out of Egypt by a mighty hand, out of the land of their bondage and into the wide wilderness on the way to a land of their own. And when the God who freed them gave them the words to live by, the great commandments that would shape them into a people, he included among them a command that no other people in all the ancient world had ever been given. He commanded them to rest. One day in every 7, he told them, "You shall do no work, neither you, nor your sons or daughters, nor your servants, nor even the animals in your fields, nor the stranger who lives among you." One whole day, set apart, holy, a day for stopping. They called it the Sabbath, which means simply to cease, to stop, to rest. It was unlike anything the world had seen. Think about how strange and wonderful that command must have been to a people freshly out of slavery. For all their lives and all their parents' lives, their worth had been measured by their labor. They were valued only for what they could produce, worked until they could work no more, and a slave who stopped was a slave who was punished. And now the God who had rescued them was telling them the opposite of everything Egypt had taught them. He was telling them that they were not slaves anymore. He was telling them that their worth did not come from their work. He was giving them a day on which they were commanded, of all things, to stop producing, or to lay down their tools, to simply be, and to remember that they belonged to someone who loved them, not to a master who used them. The Sabbath was not a burden laid on them, it was a gift handed to them. It was freedom, woven into the very rhythm of their week. And the gift reached back even further than Egypt, all the way to the very beginning of the world. For the people remembered that when God made the heavens and the earth, he worked for 6 days. And on the 7th day he rested, not because he was tired, but to set a pattern into the fabric of creation itself, a rhythm of work and rest, of labor and peace, written into the world from its first week. To keep the Sabbath, then, was to step into something as old as creation, to live in the rhythm God himself had lived in, to trust that the world would keep turning even when you stopped pushing it. It was a weekly reminder that you are not the one holding everything together. You can stop, you can rest. The world does not depend on your endless striving, and you were never meant to carry it as if it did. So hold that thought close tonight, because it is the quiet truth at the center of everything that follows. Rest is not laziness, and it is not weakness, and it is not something to be earned only after every task is finished, for the tasks are never finished. Rest is a gift, woven into the world by the one who made it, offered to slaves and the weary and the heavy laden, as a sign that they are loved for who they are and not for what they produce. The people of Galilee, all those centuries later, still kept that day. Every week, as the sun went down on the 6th evening, the work of the whole region would slow and stop. The lamps would be lit, the tables would be spread, and a holy stillness would settle over the towns along the lake. It is into one such evening, one particular Sabbath in Capernaum, that our story now takes us, to see how that day of rest fell across a handful of very different lives, and what it revealed in each of them. It helps to imagine for a moment just how radical that one command really was, set against the world it was given into. Every other people of the ancient world ran on the same brutal logic that Egypt ran on. You worked until you could not work, and then you worked some more, and your value rose and fell with what your hands could produce. The gods of the nations were demanding and hungry, and rest was something only the rich and the powerful could afford, or bought with the labor of those beneath them. No one had ever heard of a God who commanded ordinary people to stop, who built rest into the law itself, who insisted that even the servant and the foreigner and the worn-out ox be given a day to simply be. It was unheard of. It turned the whole order of things on its head. The God of this people was telling them that they were not machines for making things, that they were not defined by their usefulness, that they were beloved children who were meant to rest in the care of a father, not slaves meant to be used until they broke. And there was a tenderness in the way the command was framed, a reason given that reached straight back into their deepest memory. Remember, the word said that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out. Keep this day, in other words, because you remember what it was to have no rest, and you remember who set you free. The Sabbath was not only a stopping, it was a remembering. Every 7th day, when the people laid down their work, they were meant to recall the long bondage they had been rescued from, and the strong and loving hand that had rescued them, and to let that memory fill them with gratitude and trust. On, they rested not into emptiness, but into the arms of the one who had freed them. Or, they stopped working because they were learning, week by week, that they could trust him to hold the world while they did. Or, the sixth day in Capernaum had a particular feeling to it, a quality of anticipation that built through the afternoon as the light grew long and golden over the lake. You could feel it in the streets, a quickening, a gentle hurry, as the whole town moved to finish its work before the sun went down and the day of rest began. For the Sabbath did not wait for anyone. It came when the sun set, ready or not, and so the hours before it were full of a busy, purposeful preparation, the last cooking, the last sweeping, the last errands run, all of it aimed at one thing, that when the holy day arrived, everything would already be done, and the people could simply stop. Picture the marketplace in those final hours, the stalls busy with people gathering what they needed for the evening meal. The bread, the wine, the oil, the small good things that made the Sabbath table different from every other table of the week. Picture the women in the houses, sweeping the floors clean, setting out the best they had, preparing the food in advance, because once the day of rest began, no cooking would be done. Picture the fishermen down at the shore, securing their boats and their nets, knowing they would not go out again until the holy day had passed. There was a rhythm to it all, ancient and familiar, a rhythm the town had kept for more generations than anyone could count. And there was a kind of beauty in the shared preparation, a whole community moving together toward the same still point. Then, as the sun touched the western hills and the light began to soften and deepen toward gold, a change would come. All across Capernaum, in house after house, the women would light the Sabbath lamps. This was their honor, an ancient and tender custom, that the woman of the household would kindle the lights that marked the beginning of the holy day, and speak the words of blessing over them, and in that small flame the Sabbath would begin. Imagine it, all through the town, in the same quiet moment, the small lights flickering to life in window after window, and the work of the whole week coming to its rest, and a holy stillness settling over the streets like a blessing. The noise of labor would fade, the hurry would cease, and in its place would come the warm glow of lamplight, the smell of bread, the low murmur of blessings, and the deep peace of a day set apart. It is a beautiful picture, and we should let ourselves feel its beauty fully, because the peace of that evening is the very thing against which the rest of our story will be measured. For here is the quiet truth that this particular Sabbath was about to reveal, the truth that makes this story more than a pretty scene. The day of rest came to everyone in Capernaum at exactly the same moment when the sun went down. But it did not find everyone in the same place. The same holy stillness fell across the whole town, but it fell on very different hearts, and what is rest to one heart can be torment to another. For rest is not only a matter of stopping your hands. It is a matter of what is happening inside you when your hands are still. And when the work finally stops and the world goes quiet, what rises up in the silence is the truest measure of a soul. There were homes in Capernaum that night where the Sabbath would settle like a blessing long awaited. Where the lighting of the lamps would feel like coming home, where the stillness would be sweet because the heart within it was at peace. And there were others where the very same stillness would feel like a weight, where the stopping of work would only make room for thy anxieties that the busyness had been holding back, where the silence would be filled not with peace but with dread. Or the Sabbath, you see, is a kind of mirror. It shows you what is really inside you, because it takes away the noise and the labor you so often use to keep from looking. Odd. When everything you do is stripped away, what is left is simply who you are, and that can be a comfort or a terror, or depending on what you find there. This is something worth sitting with for your own life tonight, on your own night of rest. Because most of us are very good at staying busy, and we are busy, in part, for a reason. As long as we are working, striving, rushing from one task to the next, we do not have to face what is waiting in the quiet. We can outrun it, but the stillness always comes eventually, in the dark hours, in the moments when the work runs out. And when it comes, it shows us what we have been carrying all along. The anxieties we have not faced, the griefs we have not grieved, the questions we have not let ourselves ask. The Sabbath of Capernaum was about to do for several people what stillness always does. It was about to show them their own hearts, and what it showed would be very different from one house to the next. So let us go now, in the deepening gold of that evening, into a few of those houses, and see how the same holy day fell across very different lives. We will go first to a small house on a quiet street, where a woman we have met before is preparing, with trembling and wonder, to keep the Sabbath for the first time in her new life. And from there we will move to other doors, to a fisherman worn down by a burden he cannot lift, and to a wealthy man who has everything except the one thing the Sabbath is made for, a place to belong. The lamps are being lit all over Capernaum. The day of rest has come, and it is about to reveal far more than anyone expects. There is something worth noticing, too, in the gentleness of how the day arrived. It did not come with trumpets, or with the crash of some great event. It came with the quiet setting of the sun, the same sun that set on every ordinary evening, and with the small flames of the lamps, and with the slow hush that fell as the labor stopped. Holiness in this story does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it comes in the softest way imaginable, in the lighting of a lamp, in the smell of bread, in the simple decision to stop and be still. A whole town did not change in any visible way when the Sabbath began. Our houses were the same houses, the streets the same streets. What changed was something quieter and deeper, a shift in the heart of the day itself, from striving to resting, from doing to simply being, marked by nothing grander than a few small flames in a few small windows. And perhaps that is a comfort, that the holy does not require us to do something enormous, that it can come to us in the smallest of gestures, in the simple act of stopping, of lighting a lamp, or of letting the day be different. But we have said that the same day fell on different hearts, and we should be honest about why that matters so much, because it is the engine of everything that follows. The Sabbath did not change anyone's outward circumstances. A man drowning in debt still owed what he owed when the sun went down. The lonely man was no less alone for the lighting of the lamps. The holy day did not reach down and fix the broken situations of the people it fell upon. What it did, instead, was reveal them. It pulled back the curtain of busyness that each of them had been hiding behind and showed, in the sudden stillness, what was truly there. And this is why the same evening could be heaven in one house, and something close to torment in another. The day was a gift to all of them equally, but a gift can only become a comfort to the heart that is able to receive it. And some hearts that night were not yet able. In a small house on a quiet street, a woman moved through the last of the afternoon light, or setting her table with a care that looked, to anyone watching, like reverence. This was Mary, the woman of Magdala, though she hardly seemed the same person now. Oh, the one who had been lost in torment, who had woken on the floors of unrecognized nights, or who had forgotten her own name, was gone. In her place stood a woman clothed, and in her right mind, her hands steady, her eyes clear, or a quiet light about her that had nothing to do with the lamps she was about to light. Or she was preparing to keep the Sabbath, and though she had seen the day kept all her life. Oof. This was in the truest sense the first Sabbath of her new life, and her heart was full of a feeling she could hardly name, mixture of wonder and gratitude and a trembling, almost fearful joy. For there is something particular about doing an ordinary thing for the first time after a long darkness. The simple acts of preparing a home, sweeping a floor, setting out bread. Things that most people do without a second thought were, for her, almost overwhelming in their goodness. She had spent so many years unable to do any of it, unable to keep a home, unable to keep herself. Now the very ordinariness of these tasks felt like a miracle. To sweep her own floor in her own right mind, to set her own table with her own steady hands, to prepare to welcome the holy day, like any other woman in Capernaum, no longer the one the town stepped around, but simply a woman keeping the Sabbath, was a gift so large she could hardly take it in. Sometimes it is the smallest, most ordinary mercies that move us most when we have known what it is to lose them. Then the moment came, as the sun touched the hills and the light turned to gold, the moment that belonged to her, the lighting of the Sabbath lamps. This was the honor given to the woman of the house, to kindle the lights that began the holy day. And as Mary reached out to light the flame, the weight of it must have settled over her in a way that nearly stopped her breath. For think of what it meant that she, of all people, should be the one to bring the light. She who had lived so long in darkness, who had been so completely overcome by it that she had given up all hope of ever seeing the light again. Now, the one whose hands would kindle the Sabbath flame. The one who would bring the light into her own home and speak the blessing over it. The very thing that darkness had stolen from her, she was now giving back to the world, one small flame at a time. Watch her in your mind as she lights it. See the small flame catch and grow, throwing its warm gold light across the simple room, across the bread and the cup, across her own face as she bends over it. See her draw the light toward herself with her hands in the ancient gesture and cover her eyes for a moment, and speak the words of blessing, her voice perhaps unsteady, perhaps barely above a whisper. Because how do you bless the light when you have spent so long in the dark? There is no scene in all the world quite like a person who has been rescued, giving thanks for the very thing they once lost. The light from that single flame would have seemed to her not like an ordinary lamp at all, but like the visible sign of everything that had happened to her, the darkness lifted, name spoken, the life given back. She was the bearer of light now, in her own small house, on her own quiet street, and the wonder of it must have filled her eyes. And as the Sabbath settled over her home, something deeper than the lamplight filled the room, a peace she had not known in all her years of torment, the peace of belonging, of safety, of being at home in her own life and in the love that had found her. This is what the Sabbath is for, not the cold keeping of a rule, but exactly this, the deep rest of a soul that knows it is held, the stillness of a heart that has stopped running because it has finally been found. Mary did not keep the Sabbath that night out of fear, or duty, or the weight of the law. She kept it out of gratitude, out of love, out of the overflowing of a heart that had been given back its life. That, as we will see, is the whole difference. The same day, the same lamps, the same blessings can be kept by two people, and be a heavy burden to one and a pure joy to the other, depending entirely on what is happening in the heart. There is something here for your own weary heart tonight, whoever you are, whatever darkness you have known. Because the deepest rest does not come from finally finishing all your work, or from earning your way into peace by being good enough. It comes from being loved. It comes from knowing that you belong to someone, that you have been found, that your worth does not hang on your striving. Mary could rest that night, truly rest, because she knew she was loved, because the one who had called her by name had shown her that she was precious, not for anything she could do, but simply because she was his. And that knowledge turned a simple meal in a simple house into a foretaste of heaven. The lamps were lit, the blessing was spoken, and in the small house on the quiet street, the true peace of the Sabbath had come to rest. But she would not keep this Sabbath alone, as it turned out. For even as the light filled her home, there were others making their way through the gathering dusk of Capernaum, who had nowhere to be. Travelers caught out as the holy day began, and her small table was about to become something larger than she could have imagined. A place of welcome, of unexpected company, of the kind of grace that takes a quiet evening and fills it with more than you planned. But before we come to that, we must leave the warm light of Mary's house and go out into the darker streets, or to other doors, where the same Sabbath was falling on hearts that could find no rest in it at all. For not every house in Capernaum that night was filled with peace. In some, the coming of the day of rest only made the lack of rest more unbearable. It is to one of those houses, down by the shore, that we turn next. It is worth dwelling too on the quiet courage it took for her to keep that day at all. For the Sabbath is a day of memory, and memory can be a tender thing for someone who has come through a long darkness. To sit in the stillness, to stop the motion of the day, is to make room for everything the motion had been holding at bay, and not all of Mary's memories were gentle ones. She had years behind her that she would surely rather not have remembered, hours lost to torment, a self she had nearly lost forever. Yet, here she was, choosing to be still, choosing to keep the holy day, choosing to light the lamp and speak the blessing, rather than to fill her evening with distraction. There is a kind of bravery in that, the bravery of a person who has decided to trust the stillness, or believe that what rises up in the quiet now will not be the old darkness, but a new and steady peace. She had been given a reason to trust it. The one who had found her had not left her, and so she could be still, and let the Sabbath do its gentle work, without fear of what the silence might hold. And as she sat in the deepening peace of her own home, perhaps she let herself remember the gentler thing, or promise from long ago, the words that had been spoken over her and had come back to her in her darkest hour. Not be afraid, for I have called you by name. The Sabbath was, in its way, those very words made into a day. A whole evening built around the truth that she was not afraid anymore, that she belonged to someone, or that she could rest. Every lamp she lit, Every blessing she spoke, every moment of stillness she allowed herself, was a quiet echo of the promise that had saved her. But she was not keeping the Sabbath to earn anything. She was keeping it because she had already been given everything. And the keeping of it was simply gratitude, taking the shape of a day. Down by the shore of the lake, in another part of Capernaum, the coming of the Sabbath fell across a very different kind of house and a very different kind of heart. Here lived a fisherman, a strong and capable man named Simon, a man who had spent his whole life on the water, who knew the lake in every mood, who could read the weather in the sky and the fish in the deep. He was the sort of others looked to, quick and forceful and sure of himself, a man used to solving his own problems with his own two hands. And on this Sabbath evening, that very strength, the thing he was most proud of, was failing him, and he did not know how to bear it. For Simon was a man under a great weight, the same weight that pressed down on so many in Galilee, a crushing burden of debt and taxes in a land ruled by a foreign empire. We have seen how it was in those days, how Rome and its collectors squeezed the ordinary people until a man could work from dark to dark and still find himself sinking. Simon had fished those waters all his life, and still the money he owed grew faster than the money he could earn, until the fear of it sat on his chest like a stone, waking him in the night, following him out onto the water, never leaving him alone. A man can carry a great deal, but the fear of losing everything, his boat, his livelihood, his freedom, the very means by which he fed those he loved, is a particular kind of torment, and Simon was deep in it. And so, while the lamps were being lit in the houses of Capernaum, while the blessings were being spoken, and the holy stillness was settling over the town, Simon could find no stillness at all. The Sabbath was meant to be a day when the nets were laid down and the boats stayed at the shore, a day of rest commanded by God himself. But how does a drowning man rest? Or how does a man whose mind is racing with debt and fear simply stop and be still and trust? The very thing the Sabbath asked of him, to cease his striving and rest in the care of God, was the very thing he could not bring himself to do, because deep down he did not believe that anyone but himself was going to save him. And a man who believes that everything depends on his own effort can never truly rest. Not on the Sabbath, not on any day, because the work is never done and the fear never sleeps. There is something deeply human in Simon's struggle, something that reaches across the centuries to almost anyone who has ever lain awake with worry. He was a man who trusted his own strength. And his strength was real, and for most of his life it had been enough. But now he had come up against a burden too large for any strength of his own to lift. And instead of letting go, instead of admitting he could not carry it alone, he gripped it tighter. He worked harder. He schemed and strained and pushed against the closing walls of his situation. Certain that if he just tried a little more, found one more angle, made one more effort, he could fix it himself. And the more he struggled, the tighter the trap seemed to close around him. The way a snare pulls tighter, the more its prisoner pulls against it. This is the quiet tragedy of the self-reliant heart. The very strength that has carried us so far becomes the thing that will not let us reach for the help we truly need. Picture him, then, on that Sabbath evening when he should have been at a table of rest. Instead, pacing, restless, his mind a storm, unable to enter into the peace that was settling over every other house. Picture the worn lines on his face, the dark circles of too many sleepless nights, the hunted look of a man being chased by something he cannot outrun. And picture, if the old accounts allow us to imagine it, the strain this put on his home, on those who loved him and watched him being slowly ground down, who longed for him simply to stop, or to rest, to let someone help him carry the weight, and who could only watch as he refused, again and again, certain that surrendering would mean losing everything. There are few sorrows harder to witness than a strong person breaking under a load they will not set down. Yet, even here, in the darkest house of our story tonight, there is a seed of hope. Oh, Simon Image could not see it, and we should hold on to it as we leave him to his restless night. For sometimes the very thing that feels like the end of us is the beginning of something far better. Sometimes a strong man has to come all the way to the end of his own strength, has to exhaust every effort and find them all useless, before he can finally do the one thing he has never been able to do, which is to stop, let go, and let himself be helped. Simon was being pressed toward the end of himself, and though it felt like ruin, it was, though he could not have believed it, the doorway to a freedom greater than anything his own strength had ever won him. For the one who had called Mary by name was already in Capernaum, and he had not forgotten the fisherman by the shore. And the day was coming. Very soon, when Simon's empty hands and exhausted strength would meet a power that asks for nothing but surrender, gives in return a rest the world can never take away. But that day had not yet come. Tonight Simon could only pace and worry and strain against the snare. The Sabbath had fallen across his house as it had across Mary's, the very same holy day, very same invitation to rest. But where she had received it as a gift, he could only feel it as one more thing he was failing to do. The lamps of the town glowed warm in the windows all around him, and he stood outside their light, alone with his burden, a strong man at the very end of his strength, not yet ready to lay it down. And while he stood there in the dark, there was still another in Capernaum for whom the Sabbath was a sorrow, man who had everything Simon lacked, and lacked the one thing that matters most. It is to him that we turn now. And there is something worth understanding about why a burden like Simon's makes rest feel impossible, because it is true of so many burdens, and perhaps of one you carry yourself. When we are afraid, truly afraid, that everything might come apart, the mind does not want to be still. Stillness feels dangerous. It feels like dropping our guard, like taking our hands off the wheel, like letting the very thing we are bracing against come crashing in. And so we keep moving, keep planning, keep turning the problem over and over, because the motion itself feels like a kind of safety, as though by never stopping we might somehow stay ahead of the thing that frightens us. But it is an illusion. The motion does not actually hold the danger back. It only wears us down until we are too exhausted to think clearly and too frightened to stop. Simon was caught in exactly that trap, running in his own mind through the long Sabbath night, unable to do the one thing that might have begun to heal him, which was simply to stop, breathe, and trust that he was not as alone in it as he felt. For that, in the end, was the deepest root of his restlessness, deeper even than the debt. It was that he believed, somewhere beneath all his striving, that no one was coming to help him, that if he did not save himself, then no one would, that the whole weight of his life rested on his own two shoulders and his own failing strength. And a man who believes that is a man who can never rest, because the work of holding up your entire world is a work that never ends. The Sabbath was offering him the opposite belief. The belief that there was a God who held the world, or who had freed slaves and could free a fisherman, who could be trusted to carry what was too heavy to carry alone. But Simon could not yet reach for it. He had not yet come to the end of his own strength. And until a self-reliant heart reaches that end, it cannot learn the thing that only the end can teach. That being unable to save yourself is not the end of the story, but very often the beginning of being saved. In a finer part of Capernaum, in a house larger and richer than any we have visited tonight, the Sabbath fell across a man who had everything that money could buy and almost nothing that the heart truly needs. His name was Matthew, and he was a tax collector, one of those men who worked for Rome, gathering from his own people the taxes that the empire demanded, and taking, as such men did, a comfortable share for himself along the way. He was wealthy. Because of it, his house was fine, his clothes were good, his table wanted for nothing. He was, on this Sabbath evening, as on every other, profoundly and bitterly alone. For the wealth of a tax collector came at a terrible price, a price that no amount of money could ever buy back. To work for Rome, to grow rich by collecting from your own neighbors the taxes that fed the empire that oppressed them, was, in the eyes of his people, a betrayal of the deepest kind. The tax collectors were despised, grouped together with the worst of sinners, shut out of the life of the community, treated as traitors who had sold their own people for silver. Matthew could walk through the streets of Capernaum and feel the eyes turn away from him, hear the muttered words, see the mothers draw their children close as he passed, just as they had once done with the woman from Magdala. For a very different reason. He had bought his comfort with his belonging. He had gained the whole world of fine things and lost his place among his own people entirely. On the Sabbath of all days made his loneliness most unbearable, for the Sabbath was, above all, a day of belonging. It was a day for families to gather, for tables to fill with the people you loved, for the generations to come together in the warm lamplight and share the bread and the blessing and the long, easy hours of rest. All across Capernaum, in house after house, that was happening, the doors opening, the families gathering, the laughter and the prayers rising up in the golden evening. Matthew, in his fine and empty house, had no such table to go to. He had no family that would have him, no community that would welcome him, no door anywhere in the town that would open to him with gladness. He had everything except the one thing the Sabbath was made for. He had no home to return to, in the way that truly matters, no people who were glad he existed. He had only his wealth and his silence, and the long hollow hours of a holy day that only made his emptiness ring louder. There is a particular ache in being surrounded by abundance and feeling utterly poor, in having every comfort the body could want and nothing the soul most needs. Matthew is, in his way, one of the loneliest figures in this whole story, lonelier even than the fisherman by the shore, because Simon at least had people who loved him and longed for him to let them help. Matthew had no one. He had made his choices and chased his comfort and built his fine house, woken one day to find himself entirely alone inside it, cut off from his people, despised in his own town, with no way back across the great gulf his own choices had carved. Money he had surely learned by now could do nothing about that kind of poverty. You cannot buy your way back into belonging. You cannot purchase a single person who is genuinely glad to see you. Or the richest man in Capernaum could be the poorest man in Capernaum, and on a Sabbath evening, in his silent house, Matthew knew it better than anyone. Or it is worth pausing here gently, because Matthew's loneliness speaks to something many people carry, even in a world very different from his. Or there are forms of poverty that have nothing to do with money. There is the poverty of a person who has everything except someone to share it with. There is the loneliness of those who have, for whatever reason, found themselves on the outside, looking in at the warm lit windows of belonging that seem to be for everyone but them. Perhaps you have known a version of that ache, the feeling of being outside the circle, of watching others gather while you stand apart, of having no table that feels like yours. If so, then Matthew is not a stranger to you, and his story holds something you need to hear, because his story, like every story we are telling, is not over. For here is the wonder that Matthew could not yet see, sitting alone in his fine house on that Sabbath night. The same one who had crossed the whole distance to call Mary by her name, the same one who was even now in Capernaum, drawing near to the broken and the lost, was not going to overlook the lonely tax collector. A day was coming, and coming soon, when this man, despised by everyone, belonging nowhere, would hear his name called too, would look up from his tax collector's table, to find the teacher from Nazareth looking straight at him, not with the disgust he had seen in every other face, but with something he had long since stopped hoping for: invitation. Follow me. 2 words, spoken to a man everyone else had written off, that would open a door Matthew thought was closed forever, and bring him at last into a family, a table, a belonging that his wealth could never have bought. But that day had not yet come. Tonight he was still alone. So there they were, as the Sabbath settled over Capernaum, 3 very different lives touched by the very same holy day. A woman in a small house, glowing with the peace of one who has been found, lighting her lamps in gratitude and wonder. A fisherman by the shore, strong and exhausted, unable to rest because he could not yet let go. A wealthy man in a fine and empty house, possessing everything but belonging, aching in his loneliness on the one day that most longs to be shared. The same Sabbath, the same invitation to rest, and 3 hearts in 3 very different places. But the evening was not over. For in the small house of the woman who had been found, something was about to happen that would gather up all the meaning of this day of rest into a single, shining moment and show, once and for all, what the Sabbath was truly for. It is to that small house and that holy moment that we now return. Or it is worth seeing clearly what kind of poverty Matthew's really was, because it is a poverty that money makes worse rather than better. A poor man who is loved still has a table to go to, still has people who are glad he came home, still has a place in the warm circle of belonging when the Sabbath lamps are lit. Matthew had none of that, and all his wealth only sharpened the loss, because it reminded him every day of exactly what he had traded away to get it. Every fine thing in his house was a small monument to the belonging he had sold. He could buy the best bread in Capernaum, but there was no one to break it with. He could afford the finest lamps, but no one to light them for. The Sabbath, which gathers the loved into warm rooms, left him standing in a fine and silent house, surrounded by everything, except the one thing that would have made any of it worth having. Odds, his was the loneliness of a man who got exactly what he reached for, and discovered too late that it was not what he needed at all. And there is a particular kind of despair that can settle on a person in that situation, or the quiet despair of believing that the door of belonging has closed for good, that the choices are already made and the gulf already fixed, that whatever warmth other people gather in is simply not for you and never will be again. Matthew, sitting alone on that Sabbath night, may well have believed that his isolation was permanent, on a sentence he had passed on himself and could never appeal. But he was wrong, though he could not have known it. The gulf he believed was fixed forever was about to be crossed, not by him, but by someone coming toward him from the other side. For the one who specialized in going to exactly the people everyone else had given up on was already in Capernaum. And a tax collector's table, of all the tables in the town, was not beneath his notice. Or the loneliest man in Capernaum was about to be sought out by name. He simply did not know it yet. Back in the small house on the quiet street, the warm lamplight glowing across the simple table, Mary was not, after all, going to keep this Sabbath alone. For as the holy day had begun and the streets had emptied, there were travelers in Capernaum who had been caught out by the setting sun, men who could not reach their own homes before the Sabbath began and who needed a place to be. So there came a knock at her door, and when she opened it, she found on her threshold a few weary travelers seeking shelter and welcome on the holy day, men who would otherwise have had nowhere to keep the Sabbath at all. Imagine the small flicker of fear that must have crossed her heart in that moment, and the courage it took to push past it. For she had never done this before, never hosted the Sabbath, never led the blessing, never stood as the woman of a household, welcoming guests to her table on the holy day. The old Mary, the lost one, would have had no table to offer and no peace to share. Even the new Mary, so recently restored, must have trembled at the thought of it, unsure of herself, afraid of doing it wrong, aware of how strange it was that she, of all people, should be the one offering welcome. Yet she opened the door. She let them in. She drew more places to her small table, made room, and offered what she had, because a heart that has been welcomed by grace cannot help but welcome others. And the one who has been let in when she had no right to expect it becomes, almost without trying, the one who lets others in. And so the small house filled with more warmth than Mary had planned. The simple meal stretched to feed unexpected guests. A lamplight falling on faces that had been strangers an hour before and were now gathered around one table in the peace of the holy day. There is a particular kind of grace in a table like that, a table where the welcome is not earned, or where people who have nowhere else to be are simply taken in and fed and blessed. It is in its small way a picture of something much larger, of the kind of welcome that does not ask what you have done or where you have been or whether you are worthy, but simply opens the door and says, "Come in, there is a place for you here." Mary's table had become such a table, and it was about to become more. For there came another knock at the door. And when it was opened, there stood a figure that turned Mary's trembling joy into something overwhelming. For there, on the threshold of her small house, was the one she knew better than any face in all the world. It was the teacher from Nazareth, the one who had reached into her darkness and called her by her name, the one who had given her back her life. He had come on the Sabbath evening to her door, to her table, to keep the day of rest in the home of the woman he had healed. Pause. And whatever words passed between them in that moment, whatever rose up in Mary's heart at the sight of him standing there in her own doorway, must have been almost beyond bearing, the gratitude, the wonder, the disbelieving joy of it. Odds, the one who had found her in the pit, had come to share her Sabbath. The light she had carried into her own home that evening had come to her door in person. He came in, and he sat down at her table. Sit with the wonder of that, because it is the heart of everything this day has been building toward. The teacher whom crowds were following, the one the whole land was beginning to wonder about, did not go that Sabbath evening to the house of the wealthy or the powerful or the religious. No, he went to the small house of a woman who had been, not long before, the most broken and despised person in the town. And he sat down at her table as if there were nowhere in all the world he would rather be. He did not stand on ceremony. He did not hold himself apart. He sat down among the gathered guests, the welcomed strangers and the restored woman, in the warm and ordinary lamplight, and he took the bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and he blessed the meal. And in that simple act, the true light of the Sabbath, the light that all the lamps of Capernaum were only pointing toward, came at last to rest in the small house on the quiet street. For this, all along, was what the Sabbath was for. Not the cold keeping of a rule, not the anxious effort to earn God's favor by getting everything exactly right. The Sabbath was made for exactly this, for the broken and the weary and the welcomed to gather at a table and be fed and blessed by a love that asks nothing but their presence. It was made for rest, the deep rest of those who know they are loved, who have stopped striving because they have finally been found. And here, in Mary's house, that rest had come fully alive, not because the people there had earned it, but because the one who is himself the true rest of every weary heart had come and sat down among them. The woman who had been called rubbish by her town, now had the Lord of the Sabbath at her table, breaking bread, smiling in the lamplight, perfectly at home. The light had come to rest in the house of the one the world had thrown away. And here is the truth that this whole evening has been carrying toward you, friend, the truth meant for your own weary heart tonight. The rest your soul is longing for was never something you had to earn. It was never a reward for finally being good enough, or finishing all your work, or fixing everything that is broken in your life. It is a gift, offered freely by one who comes to the door of the broken and the lonely and the lost, and asks only to be let in, to sit down at your table, to share your bread, to bring his peace into your ordinary house. You do not have to be worthy of that visit. Mary was not. You do not have to have your life in order first. None of them did. You only have to open the door. The deepest rest in all the world is not something you achieve. It is someone who comes to you and sits down with you and blesses the bread and makes your small and ordinary table into a place where heaven has come to stay. It is worth lingering on the fact that he came to that particular house on that particular evening, because everything about it overturns what people expected of holiness. A teacher of God on the most sacred evening of the week might have been expected to keep the Sabbath in the home of the most respectable family in town, or surrounded by the learned and the devout, where every rule would be kept perfectly and every custom honored. Instead, he came to the small house of a woman who had been, until very recently, the most broken person in Capernaum. And he filled it with welcomed strangers, and he sat down among them, as though this were the holiest place in all the world. And perhaps that evening it was, for holiness in this story is not found where everything is proper and impressive. It is found where grace is welcomed, where the door is opened to those who have nowhere else to go, where the broken and the lost are gathered and fed and blessed. The grand houses of Capernaum kept the Sabbath that night with great correctness. But the true light of the Sabbath came to rest in the humble house where the door had been opened wide. And think of what that meant for the welcomed strangers at her table, the travelers who had knocked at her door with nowhere else to keep the holy day. They had come seeking only a roof and a corner, a place not to be turned away on the Sabbath. And they found themselves instead at a table where the teacher from Nazareth himself broke the bread and spoke the blessing. They had asked for so little and been given so much simply because they happened to knock on the right door, or the door of a woman who knew what it was to be welcomed when she had no right to expect it, and who therefore could not bring herself to turn anyone else away. There is a pattern in that worth holding on to. The welcomed become the welcomers. The found go looking for the lost. The ones who have been carried learn, almost without trying, how to carry others. Once it truly lands in a heart, does not stay still. It spreads outward from one open door to the next until the whole world is studded with small bright rooms where no one is turned away. And so we come to the quiet end of tonight's story. And here, in the last of it, let us slow our steps and gather up everything we have seen, or the way you might gather the warmth of a fire around you before you sleep. We have followed a single day, one Sabbath evening in Capernaum, as it fell across very different lives. We saw it begin in the memory of slaves who had forgotten how to rest, and we saw the gift of a holy day given to set them free. Saw it come to a woman who had been found, and fill her small house with light and welcome, and the presence of the one who had saved her. We saw it come, too, to those who could not yet receive it, a fisherman too burdened to be still, a wealthy man too alone to belong, each of them standing outside the very rest that was being offered to them. And the lesson of that long evening is one worth carrying gently into your own night. For the Sabbath showed us that rest is not finally about stopping our work. It is about the state of our hearts when the work stops. Mary could rest because she knew she was loved, because she had been found, because she had nothing left to prove. Simon could not rest, not because he lacked the time, but because he still believed that everything depended on his own strength, and a heart like that can never be still. Matthew could not rest because he had no place to belong, no table that was truly his. The same holy day, the same invitation, fell on all of them. The difference was not the day. The difference was whether they could receive what it offered, whether they could let themselves be loved, be found, be welcomed in. So let this be the gift you take from tonight's story. Whoever you are, and whatever you have carried into this hour. The rest your soul most longs for is not waiting on the far side of your finished work. For the work is never finished. It is not a reward for finally getting your life in order. It is offered to you now, tonight, exactly as you are, by one who comes to the door of the weary and the burdened and the lonely, asks only to be let in. If you are tired tonight, you are exactly the kind of person this rest was made for. If you feel that you have nothing to offer, that you are too broken or too far behind or too alone, then you are standing precisely where Mary stood and precisely where Simon and Matthew would soon be found. the very place where grace loves most to come knocking on. And remember, as you drift towards sleep, that this is only one more night on a long and beautiful journey we are walking together, and that the journey is far from over. Odd, the fisherman by the shore, who could not yet let go of his burden, will not stay in his darkness forever. Odd, for the one who calls the lost by name has not forgotten him, and a day is coming when his empty hands and exhausted strength will meet a power that asks only for surrender. And the lonely man in his fine and empty house will not be alone forever either. For that same one is going to look straight at the despised tax collector and say the two words that will give him back a family at last. Follow me. These stories are still unfolding. There are so many more nights ahead of us, so many more lives being quietly gathered, or so many more hearts being made ready. We have only just begun to see what he is doing in the towns along that little gray lake. So let your shoulders come down now, and let your breathing grow slow and deep, and let the long week you have carried into this hour begin to loosen and fall away. You do not have to finish anything tonight. You do not have to fix anything tonight. You do not have to earn your rest, or prove your worth, or carry the weight of the world on your own tired shoulders for one more moment. You can lay it all down, the way the people of Capernaum laid down their work when the sun went down and the lamps were lit. The will keep turning while you rest. It does not depend on you. You were never meant to carry it alone. You can stop now. You can be still now. You can let yourself be held by the one who made the very gift of rest, who is even now standing at the door of your weary heart, asking only to be let in. Let this be a small prayer as you settle into the quiet. For the Lord of the Sabbath, who came to a small house and blessed an ordinary table, come to me tonight, where I am burdened. Teach me to let go. Where I am alone, gather me in. Where I have been striving and cannot rest, give me the deep rest of one who knows he is loved. Let me sleep tonight, not as a slave to my fears, but as a child who is safe and found home. Amen. And now may peace be upon you, real and deep. The peace of that holy evening, the peace of a table where the bread is blessed and no one is turned away. May the burdens of your week grow light. May you know, as you fall asleep, that you do not have to hold everything together, that you are loved, not for what you do but for who you are, and that the rest you long for has a name, is near. Rest now, friend. The lamps are lit, the bread is blessed. The day of rest has come. Sleep gently, Lord, and we will walk on together toward the morning when you are ready. For you, let your mind rest on that one image. From tonight, the image of a table with the lamps lit and the bread blessed, and a place set for everyone who came to the door. Because that table is a picture of something far larger than one Sabbath evening in one small town. It is a picture of the kind of welcome that stands at the very center of this whole long story we are telling. The welcome of a God who does not wait for us to make ourselves presentable, who does not check our worthiness at the threshold, who sets a place for the broken and the burdened and the lonely and says, simply, come in. Whatever has made you feel that you would not be welcome at such a table, whatever you have done or failed to do or carried for too long, hear this gently as you drift off. There is a place set for you. The door is open. You do not have to clean yourself up first. You only have to come. And if rest does not come easily tonight, if your own burdens feel as heavy as the fisherman's, or your own loneliness as deep as the tax collector's, then let the gentleness of this be the last thing you hold. You are not asked to fix it all tonight. You are not asked to be strong, or worthy, or finished. You are asked only to lay it down for these few quiet hours, and to trust that you are held by one who never sleeps, who carries the world so that you do not have to, who knows your name and has set a place for you at his table. The lamps are lit, the blessing is spoken, the day of rest has come, and it has come for you.